The first section regarding Barrett's esophagus would be about the pathogenesis of Barrett's esophagus. How does Barrett's esophagus really occur? What are the steps that are taken? What are the abnormalities that takes place within the epithelium that causes this differentiation in the epithelium of the esophagus? In this section, we'd be studying about the physiological abnormalities that help in increasing the severity of the gastroesophageal reflux disease, and then ultimately causing Barrett's esophagus. And then what is Barrett's metaplasia? How can one cell type change into another cell type within the esophagus? And then what is the role of epithelial cells? How do they resist the acid reflux within the esophagus? So the physiological abnormalities. The Barrett's esophagus is very prone to any sort of reflux injury, and the increase in the gastroesophageal reflux disease causes Barrett's esophagus ultimately. There are different types of abnormalities that occur within the esophagus that causes these potential consequences. The first that we'd be studying about is the extreme hypotension of lower esophageal sphincter. The lower esophageal sphincter, when it relaxes, it causes the reflux of the gastric contents into the back into the esophagus. So this causes the gastroesophageal reflux disease. The second important thing is the ineffective esophageal motility. This means that the clearance within the esophagus is defective. The defective clearance of the reflux material causes more injury to the mucosal surface of the esophagus. The third section is the gastric acid secretion, which causes increased acid secretion and causes a reflux of highly acidic gastric juice, which resides for a more time period within the esophagus and causes more mucosal injury to the esophagus. And then the dudenogastric reflux, the reflux that occurs from the duodenum and the gastric into the esophagus, which causes a very injurious effect to the mucosal surface of the esophagus. And this is because of the reflux of the bile acids and the pancreatic enzymes. And then the decreased salivary secretion of epidermal growth factor. This causes a very delayed healing of the reflux damaged area of the esophagus. Delayed healing would cause more and more damage to the esophageal surface, and this is all because of the decreased epidermal growth factor. And lastly, the decreased esophageal pain sensitivity to reflux caused caustic material, which causes a failure to initiate therapy. This happens when the patient is completely ignorant of the reflux that occurs. He doesn't feel any pain, and the reflux keep occurring, and he doesn't go to the doctor, and he doesn't start any medication, and the reflux keep on occurring, and then it can ultimately cause Barrett's esophagus. Barrett's metaplasia. It has been proposed that the result of Barrett's metaplasia is due to two processes, which is called as transdifferentiation and transcommitment. Now, what is transdifferentiation? Transdifferentiation occurs when the squamous cell is being changed into columnar cell due to the reflux-induced alterations. And transcommitment, it occurs when the esophageal stem cells, they're being differentiated straight into columnar epithelium instead of being differentiated into the normal squamous epithelium of the esophagus. There are few genes that are being upregulated by the reflux-induced esophagitis, which ultimately causes metaplasia. These genes which are involved are the CDX genes, which differentiates the intestinal epithelial cells to be more prone to metaplasia. And the second gene involved is the hedgehog target gene BMP4, which ultimately causes columnar differentiation instead of squamous differentiation of the normal esophagus. In this picture, we can see that this is the normal esophagus. It has no inflammation, no injury, and the epithelium of the esophagus is of the normal squamous epithelium. And in this picture, we can see that there's the duodenal reflux and the gastric reflux, which causes ultimately injury and inflammation of the esophagus, and which ultimately causes metaplastic columnar tissue, which changes the epithelium of squamous epithelium into columnar epithelium. And then again, there were two hypotheses that were being argued about. The first hypothesis was that the proximal migration of the stem cells from the gastric cardia, from the portion of the stomach which is called as the cardia, these cells migrate into the esophagus and then cause the differentiation and causes the metaplastic epithelium to occur. And the second is the expansion of a nest residual embryonic cells which is located in the esophagogastric junction. Esophagogastric junction is the junction where the esophagus is attached to the stomach. And in there, the embryonic cells, they ultimately differentiate into columnar cells instead of squamous epithelium. This is the histological picture of normal esophagus, which has squamous epithelium, as you can see, the flat nucleus. There are many of the flat nucleus, and they're all the flat cells, which is the characteristic feature of a squamous epithelium. And this is the Barrett's esophagus. It has a columnar-like cell structures and their oval nucleus, which is characteristic of a columnar epithelium. The Barrett cells are ultimately very resistant to any sort of esophageal injury to the mucosa. The Barrett cells, unlike squamous cells, which are very prone to any acid reflux and any injury due to the reflux. Unlike the squamous epithelium, the Barrett cells, they secrete mucins, and they express tight junctions with the help of a protein which is called as claudin 18. And they also render the epithelium more resistant to any sort of acid peptic attack. That is, that if the reflux occurs from the stomach back into the esophagus, it renders very resistance towards this reflux that occurs, and it protects the mucosal surface from this acid. In this picture, we can see these are the cells of the epithelium. This green-like protein structure is ultimately the claudin 18, the protein, which helps in providing a tight junction between the cells. This tight junction then ultimately inhibits and resists any sort of acid that squeezes through the cells. That is why these cells are very tightly packed. In this section, we've studied about the esophagus, the Barrett's esophagus. What occurs that there are many different types of abnormalities that ultimately predisposes to gastroesophageal reflux disease, and thus gastroesophageal reflux disease occurs, and the ultimate cause is of the Barrett's esophagus. This is one of the complications of Barrett's esophagus. And then secondly, we've studied about the Barrett's esophagus metaplasia. How does one cell completely change into a different cell? A squamous epithelium completely changes into a columnar epithelium. And ultimately, we've seen that how does epithelial cells help in resisting this acid attack? The presence of claudin, which is the protein, which helps in resisting any sort of acid attack. The tight junctions, which causes a resistance to the injury to the mucosal surface of the esophagus. That's all from this section. Thank you for watching sqadia.com.